All right, so second talk, let's get going, because I have 52 minutes. Hi, I'm Derick. I'm European. Talk to me about that later in the pub if you have to. I do not work for WordPress, so I like wearing that t-shirt. I work on a MongoDB PHP drive, which I won't be talking about at all. I did, at one time in the past, work on the date and time support in PHP. I think I added most of the stuff back in 2005, but I'm still sort of hacking on this a little bit once in a while, especially when people file bug reports, which there are unfortunately still a few left of, because if you thought the last maths was hard, try this one. Because people keep changing the rules all the time, but we'll get to that in a moment. All right, so let's start with a little quiz. So I'm going to show you a few phrases on the screen, and you need to tell me whether it is right by raising your arm, okay? Can we do that? Each day is 24 hours.
Which planet?
Okay. Good question. Planet Earth. Planet Earth. Because yeah, if it'd be Mars, it'd be 39 minutes longer, right? Everybody knows that. All right. So I saw a few hands. You were incorrect. Not every day is 24 hours, right? Because we have daylight savings time, and some days have 25, and sometimes you have 23 hours. So each day is 23, 24, 25 hours. Is that correct? Well, this is correct. Well, there's a caveat here. I mean, there are things like leap seconds, which make this untrue. However, PHP doesn't care about them. So from PHP's point of view, this is correct. The next one. Every time exists only once during a day. Like every hour-minute combination.
12 hours, 24 hours.
Oh, there's a 12-hour, 24-hour clock, which is another debate altogether. I hadn't even thought about that. You're very right there. But of course, if you go away from daylight savings time, you have in the UK 1:30 twice, right? One's still in BST and one's in GMT. February is 28 to 29 days. Who thinks this is correct? Okay, no, not correct. Not correct, because Sweden has thought it would be fun to have February 30th a few times. Every year, 365 days. Who think that's correct? No, just the leap days, right? Every year, 365 and 366 days. Who thinks that's right? Yes, but no. So it is possible to have 364 days, theoretically. Because once in a while, people change the daylight savings time rules to jump a whole day. So in those cases, you can 364 days. So I know it's only happened once. It does happen. Everybody understands what this number means. I never know whether it is April 11th or November 4th, right? It's a very annoying thing if you deal with your American coworkers, which in just general conversation drop 616, and I have no idea what it means. I thought about talking about stock prices at some point. Same thing, Pi Day. Makes no sense to me whatsoever. Unless it's a day where you eat pie, which is a good day. All right, GMT is UTC. Who thinks that's correct? Okay, one here. Sort of, but not really. GMT is an expression of UTC. It's an expression saying that we are the same 0 seconds away from UTC. But technically, there are two different concepts. For PHP, it doesn't really matter because they have the exact same value. Time zones are whole hour offsets of UTC. Who thinks that's right? No? Who has a counterexample? India, that's a good one, yeah. India does half hours. Nepal does 3/4 of an hour, because why not? So time zones are half-hour offset of UTC. I already spoiled that, so we can skip that. So the jump to daylight savings time is in March. It's not in Australia, right? It's the other way around, Southern Hemisphere. Always tricky. The difference between standard and daylight savings time is an hour. Who thinks that's right? Who has a counterexample then? Because there's one. So there's an area in New Zealand that only jumps half an hour forwards and back. Because why not? The daylight savings time is always ahead of standard time. Nope, I see people shaking their head. Do you know the answer? Where this is not correct? It's very close by. It's in Ireland. Ireland defines their standard time as their daylight savings time, or what we call BST, I should say, which I found out about a couple of months ago by reading some from by reading through legislation. Not quite sure how I ended up getting there, but there must have been a good reason for it. And I found out that they have a negative daylight savings zone. So I reported to the time zone, the people that maintain the time zone of time zone rules, really. And then they thought it was necessary to change some rules that then broke basically every computer language making use of the database, because they hadn't accounted for this. Which one did work? PHP. By sheer luck, to be honest. But all right, each country has one time zone. You probably know that's not right, because the US on it. China spends 5 geographical time zones. Who thinks that's right? Yeah, that's correct. So I need to throw you off a little bit sometimes. So daylight savings time always stay the same. Yeah, that's clearly not true either, right? They always announce at least a year in advance. No? Clearly not correct. What about they always announce in advance? Unfortunately, also not correct. Sometimes they thought, oh, yeah, we changed daylight savings time rules yesterday. It does happen. We're trying to fix that. It's very annoying. PST, Pacific Standard Time, who thinks that's correct? It's correct, but not only. Pakistan Standard Time. So my point here is that you can't really rely on those 3-letter abbreviations, because they mean something else in different territories. Also, if you're on Windows, they don't even use them. They have like Pacific Standard Time. They use the full names out of them. So they're not standard for anything. A time zone identifier is the capital of a region. I'll get back to that in a moment. No, correct. Date calculations are easy. Clearly not right. Who thinks this is correct? Who thinks this is correct? You raising your hand there? Really? April has 31 days? Okay. No? It makes it May 1, doesn't it? Who thinks this is right? This is one you can argue about. All right, so that was for the quiz. Now I need to get to do something useful, actually. So you've probably realized that this stuff is complicated. That was the point of the quiz. And there are approximately 500 different time zones on the world. That sounds a lot higher than you imagine it, because a time zone rule is not only the current changes in rules, and the changes in rules are you go from standard time to daylight savings time, or in case of Ireland, the other way around. But these rule sets, they sometimes change, not only just per country, but sometimes per region. I know it's hard to see here, all the red dots here, but see how many there are in the US alone. There are so many, because the last time they changed the rules in 2007, some counties in Indiana wanted to switch to other areas, because that's the economic regions they're interacting with the most. And it makes a lot of sense if you think about it, right? It's like local issues make it sometimes necessary to then make those changes. And that means that suddenly you have, for this very small area, you have another time zone, because the time zone encodes the current rules, but also historical rules. Or what the time zone database actually does is it does it anything from 1970 gets its own time zone. Because if you go back all the way in the 1800s, every city has its own time zone, right? And that is a bit too much to implement. Luckily, you can calculate these depending on your latitude and longitude, if you really want to do that. So what PHP does, it uses the time zone identifiers in the form of region / largest populated city in that region, so not capital. Hence, there is Asia Shanghai and not Asia Beijing. The Chinese don't necessarily like that very much, but we're not changing that. But you sometimes, because in states it gets more complicated, so you have America, Indiana, Knox being the name of a country, and so on. And there's a few more of these. So this database gets updated approximately 20 times a year. This year, not so much. In the past, it was 25 times. It just depends on the year, because they change sometimes very sudden and almost always based on political issues. Venezuela thought, oh, let's go to 4.5 hours away from UTC because we don't want to be in the same time as any US states, for example. These things happen. North Korea did the same, but they recently switched back. And yeah, PHP releases therefore often will have an outdated database, because PHP comes with this database built in, which is kind of handy, because it means at least on all the PHP versions it works the same everywhere, and operating systems. But it does mean that sometimes it gets outdated. And in order to fix that, you can install the extension TimezoneDB, which isn't really an extension. It doesn't really provide you any functionality. The only thing it does is it drops in a new version of the database. So you can get the latest rules if you want to do that. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the datetime functionality actually in PHP, because there's a whole lot of things in there that you might not be aware about. I'm sure some of you, including myself once in a while, are still doing date and time calculations just based on Unix timestamps, right? Because it's a nice convenient number, but pretty useless if you want to take into account calculations that take into account daylight savings time, for example. All right, so in PHP you can set a default time zone. The default time zone is the zone that you will use if no other zone information has been specified. So you can set it either in PHP INI with date.timezone, I think it is actually, and you can set it in your scripts or in your applications by using date default timezone set. There's also date default timezone get if you want to. I'm setting it here to Norway because back in the way I ordered the support, I was living near there somewhere, and so I'm doing new date time, and because I'm not specifying any zone information in this time string, it will use the default time zone, which is in this case Europe Oslo. I don't have to tell it whether it's in daylight savings time or not, because by just seeing the name Europe Oslo, it will know that already for you. And then you can format it with E, and you get this ISO 860 or whatever number it is. So yeah, you can also get the time zone to figure out which one PHP INI has set, for example. In the past, PHP would automatically try to guess according to the UTC offset and whether daylight savings time was in effect and your time zone abbreviation, try to guess the right time zone identifier for you. It doesn't do that anymore because it never really worked, because it is way too complicated to do, and then you might get weird results that you can't explain. So we remove that. All right, so I have a few more questions here. So what shows if I run this little script here? Anyone wants to guess? Which shows a year 2018. Which month does it show? March. Right, that's still correct. Which date does it show though? It's a trick question, of course. You should know that by now, right? I'm full of the trick question. So it actually shows you March 8th. Now, why does it show March 8th? Because I set the default time zone to Europe Oslo. Yes. So what actually happens if I parse this string, even though it has a different time zone in there, in this case Toronto, because the timestamp that str2time returns has no time zone information associated with it anymore. It can't, it has a number. It's a number of seconds since midnight 1970 UTC. That's what a Unix timestamp is. And of course, when you start formatting it, it needs to pick some time zone, and it will pick the default time zone that is currently set, which in this case was Europe London. It doesn't matter, anything that pushes it over the date boundary will do this. So this is not great, right? So lesson learned here, don't use Unix timestamps for anything, because you don't have to. Instead of that, PHP has an object, or actually, sorry, has two different classes built in it. The second one I'll get to in a moment. The first one, date time, is accept the same arguments as str2time. You can give it any sort of reasonably approximate string of date time information, and it really tries really hard to do the right thing there. And returns that not only, it then returns this object. This object contains a number of seconds since 1970 UTC, but it also remembers which time zone it was created with. Now, if you would not have specified any, as we have done here, it would remember the default time zone that you have set. But it will remember that and keeps it associated with the datetime object until you either change it or you destroy the object, right? So there's nothing else there. It will always keep that information there. So it returns the datetime object, and you can access the number of seconds since 1978 through, but it will return a string. The reason why it returns a string, because in the past when I was adding this, PHP was still used on 32-bit platforms quite a lot, and the range is limited on 32-bit platforms between about 1901 to 2038. Now, the datetime object itself encapsulates a much larger number. It uses 64 bits for this, which, if I remember correctly, can do 131 billion years in the past to 131 billion years in the future, which is at least can encapsulate all of history in there, because the universe, as far as you know it right now, is about 13.9 billion years old. So plenty of space. It's like I'm a bit more confident here saying that this is big enough for everybody. A lot more confident than saying 640 kilobytes is enough for everybody, right? So this DateTime object, although it stores this information, you can also do lots of other things with, like calculations. All right. So the calculations that you can do, we'll get back to in a moment. There's a bunch of other interesting functions in here that also try to parse DateTime information in such a way that if you get user input sometimes, people like to input random stuff in date fields. I'm sure you have seen that before. It still tries to parse it, and it'll actually tell you with the date parse function which things it managed to figure out, but also where it didn't know what was going on, and then will raise a warning or an error depending on what shows up. So this looks very complicated. Is not very complicated. So date parse basically runs an array with all the different fields that PHP understands in a DateTime string. So this you standard year, month, hour, day, whatever. It also sees the Timezone identifier or the UTC offset if there is one. And then two other elements are warnings and errors. So the warnings count. A warning happens if, for example, you have a dual timezone identifier. So if you have GMT plus 0, 1, 0, 0, it's a very common thing to see. Technically, you have two timezone identifiers, so PHP won't fall over for that one. But if you have 3, for example, or your numbers are too high, or you try in boogie woogie instead of April, then it will error out because it's clearly incorrect. And you get then some result out, and you can actually figure out exactly in which positions these things happen. So you can show, if you really want a message to you saying, you mistyped something right here. Yeah. All right, so what does this mean? I want to guess. The 8th of March, 2010, or 10 years, could mean anything, right? It could mean August 3rd, 2010, or March 10th, 2008, or March 8th, 2010. Date formats are really tricky because they all depend on local culture and whether you're wrong, basically. So this is a constant struggle with my American coworkers. I at least got on my team now to not use things like 8/3 anymore, but they use the number and the name of the month. No confusions ever. It's brilliant. But it's not getting there. But of course, sometimes you get date formats in that you do not know, but you still want to parse the data from, right? And that is also possible because there's a date create from format function, which returns a DateTime object, or there's a date parse from format function. And what they actually do is they take like format specifiers that you pretty much the same one that you would use for outputting a date in a specific format. And then, according to this format, it will try to parse the input that you put in there. And there's a few interesting things in there, like the exclamation mark says, reset everything to 1970 midnight, because otherwise it will use the current date and time. It's sometimes what you want, sometimes you don't want to do that. I guess now in hindsight, the default should have been the other way around. But we can't change this anymore because of course people use this. And then from that on, it will parse those patterns one group at a time to do something with. So the first thing, the exclamation mark will make it midnight 1970. Then it sees the year and it tries to parse the year in the string bits. It figures out somehow that it has 2 digits and then turns it into 2006. There's some complicated rules there. The star basically matches every separator that is defined. Then it does the day, and then it does the month. Luckily, nobody has a default order of year, day, month. Even the Americans do that, because they do them all day. But you never know what people come up with sometimes, right? All right, so that's parsing dates, but the DateTime object you can also modify. So you can call things again. So if you have a date or a DateTime object, and you say, I do plus 2 days, you get a date that is 2 days in the future, which is All right, I had modified the bottom one, but not the top one. So that should have said, of course, March 17, 2018, and then it would have made sense on the slide. Yes. So yeah, 2 days, adds 2 days. Then saying do Friday plus 3 weeks, so that it takes the example, so it adds 2 days here, then from that date it does another Friday plus 3 weeks, which means skip to the nearest Friday, unless today's a Friday, then it wouldn't. and then do plus 3 weeks. So skip to Friday and then does 3 weeks. If it was already Friday, it wouldn't do that, but you can say next Friday, then it will always do that. Crash.
The nearest Friday, is that always forwards?
It's always forwards in this case, yes, unless you use last Friday, because then we'll go to the previous one, which is handy. And if you say Friday ago, which is not the same as last Friday, because the same rules apply for Friday ago as it would be for Friday. If it's already Friday, it wouldn't go to the previous one. These things are very complicated. They're written down in the documentation. They are so complicated because everybody wants to do whatever they like to do with it. And so there have to be different rules for this. It's just, you cannot make a guess, right? So you need to provide opportunities. So if you're on the Friday and you do next Friday, you'll skip to the next Friday. But you can also see that it automatically figures out that there's now daylight saving time in effect, and it will adjust the output accordingly, which is really handy, of course. There are some tricky bits. If you do plus an hour and you just go out of daylight savings time, the hour suddenly doesn't exist, right? So it needs to skip another hour forward. So then sometimes, even though you're on an hour, it looks like you went 2 hours forward, but that's not really the case because the hour didn't really exist. Again, complicated, but yeah, date calculations are complicated. PHP tries to do what makes most sense for most people, but sometimes gets that wrong. All right, so the previous slide you saw that after I done a modify, it uses the information in there to then continue modifying on the next one, right? And that is not always necessarily what you want. So what we're having here, so as we create a new datetime object for, was it April 17th? We do, the new object is ts modify plus 2 days, and then when we then output both date times with the format here, the output unfortunately is exactly the same, which is a bit weird if you look at this, right? What modify unfortunately does, it modifies the original object and then also returns it. Now, that is probably the biggest mistake in designing this API, and this is why we now have DateTime Immutable, which doesn't have this problem. What I would really like in PHP 8 or 9 to make the default this immutable datetime object, because the name is really long and annoying. But I guess you can use namespaces in PHP to say use datetime as datetime immutable, but then I'm sure you're going to make your coworkers very unhappy. But you can. All right, so the result when you do this, of course, the original one doesn't change. This is what you expect. Please, please, please use datetime immutable. All right. Okay, a little bit back to time zones. Time zone objects are also represented with PHP objects in the datetime object. These you cannot modify, so you don't have the problem with immutability. And so every datetime object or datetime immutable object will have this datetime zone object embedded in it, which you can get out of it by calling get timezone. There's no example on this slide here. But what you can also do with it is attach a new datetime zone object with the already existing datetime in order to modify what it would output, which is what we're doing here. So, second example here. So, while parsing a string, you can pass in this datetime zone object, and that then overrides the default time zone has been set. But if you specify time zone information in the string itself, it would use that information because it has precedence. So parse time zone does not override this parse time zone that's already in it. So in this case, it uses Europe London and not Pacific Honolulu. All right, so if you have, there we go, a datetime immutable class object that is from a specific date and time, we create it with Pacific Honolulu. Then we set the time zone to the one in Melbourne. We output both things, and of course you get now different output because PHP has remembered the time zone that was part of both of these datetime objects. And then the output is something like this. Spans over a different date because Honolulu and Melbourne are so far apart. How many hours? 21 hours apparently. That you get a different date, which makes sense if you think of it, of course. So you can do a little bit more with time zones because, I mean, there's a database in there, so there's some utilities that you can get out of it, which can be sometimes useful for figuring out which regions or which countries, which time zone identifiers belong to that specific region. So if you want to list all the time zones that PHP supports for Europe, you do timezone identifiers list date time zone Europe, and then you get the following output. Well, part of the following output, because there's about 50 entries in there. Similarly, you can restrict it to countries, and it uses this ISO 639-2 country codes, and then you will only get them for specific countries. So in this case, you get America ADAC all the way to, I can't scroll with my clicker. But it also includes Pacific Honolulu. Even though that is in a different region, it's still part of the US, so it includes that as well. Now, I have to say one thing. To create a user interface for selecting a time zone, I would not recommend you use these time zone identifiers. They're solely there to identify a specific set of rules for a specific time zone. If you want to make this palatable for a user through UI, what I would recommend you to do is have a look at CLDR, the Common Data Language Repository, if I'm correct. It's part of the Unicode consortium, Unicode project really, which writes down what the names of all those different time zones are for each different language and different platforms and so on. This is not meant to be displayable to the user because sometimes those names are a bit weird in there. Now, if you created a time zone object, there is a possibility for fetching a comment out of it, which is probably better to display to the user if you really want to go this way. It basically tells you especially for the really tricky regions, like there's some parts in Mexico that have shifted around, or Indiana, it will tell you which counties are then belonging to that, which might be a bit easier to show you if you really want that. I unfortunately don't have time to show you how to do CLDR related things, but I have it on my to-do list to write a blog post about it, but I haven't done so yet. All right, so a few more things. There are intervals that PHP supports, and a date interval is basically the difference between two dates. You can create them in multiple different ways. You can do with this really annoying, complicated ISO standard thing, or the abbreviated notation where you create an interval that says the period is 3 days, and then you have 6 hours for the time. The T needs to be there because it uses an M for both months and minutes. And hence the T being important, being there, that stands for time. But probably the most useful thing in there is that you can create an interval by comparing to already existing datetime objects, which is what we're doing in the third one here. Right? So we create a datetime immutable. No argument means now. And then whenever I wrote those slides a month ago or so, and then we run the difference by calling diff. So what this returns is a way how to get from the D1 object to the D2 object. That isn't necessarily always the same as going from the D2 object to the D1 object. Because sometimes rules, when you get like +1 month, that is not necessarily always reversible to make sense. I have an example of that later. So it is important that you remember which direction it goes. It goes from the D1 object to the D2 object. The PHP documentation describes it quite well if you want to look this up later. And then this interval you can format with days, hours, minutes, or months, days, hours, and minutes. You see there's 2 letters for days. There's an A and a D. The reason for that is that an A is the total number of days, and the D is supposed to be used with the M because it gives you the return back in months and days, which isn't always as intuitive as you might think what the number for that should be, because date math is hard. And then you get an output like this. So basically what it says, I wrote this presentation 53 days, 9 hours and 35 minutes ago, or 1 month and 27 days. The months also keeps track of which months it has been, right? Because February doesn't have the same amount of days as March, so that's why there are 2 different ways of representing this. What you can also do is you can create those intervals from existing strings that you can pass into a modifier. So in this case, we create an interval for next weekday, which is a way of saying go to the next weekday, but ignore the Saturdays and Sundays as an additional feature in here. These things are not reversible. They are only reversible if you specify the strings, but only using quantifiable months, dates, hours. It needs to be a number, not like a wishy-washy statement as next weekday. The rules for reversing these aren't always very easy to do, so we decided instead not to do them at all to prevent confusion and arguing about what is the right one of doing it, of course. So these intervals you can then later use for doing other things with, like adding them or subtracting them from an existing date. As I said, you can only subtract some of them, not all of these. So if you start with April 20th, what we do here, we do create from string next weekday, and then we add that. Then we go to Monday, April 23rd, which makes sense because we skip the weekend, right? And similarly, if we do subtract with 3 months and 10 days, those are full numbers, so we can calculate that. It will go back to, what was it, Wednesday, January 10th. Remember, because this is date immutable, it does not do that from the thing that we've already called this on. If we would have used DateTime here, then it would have used the last value after doing next weekday. So please don't do that, confuses you. Similarly, there's lots of additional extra phrases in there. Annoying one is that some people have are things like previous months and next month. So example time. We are January 31st, but when we run this example, we get March 3. Does that make any sense to you? No? It's a curious thing. Out of the blue, I asked my wife whether that makes sense. And she said, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense, because what happens is that, well, you add 1 to the month, which makes it February 31st. That, of course, makes no sense, because February only has 28 days, so it adds 3 days, and you end up at March 3. It's not very difficult. But you do need to know how it works. And PHP tries not to do magical things here. If you do things like previous month to next month, it will modify the month number. That's the only thing it does, and then it relies on overflowing rules to show you the right date. This is a point of contention. Not everybody agrees with this. But I have to say that in the case where people don't agree with it, what they really think that they are doing is that they have a random month and they just want to go to the next month, right? Which is a perfectly valid thing to do. PHP can do that too, but you need to... I've done the explanation already, so I can skip that. You can do that by a phrase like first day of next month or last day of next month. That would work as well. So what this actually does, it starts, well, first of all, gives you the right date. But how this works is, well, next month is still done first. So increase the month number by 1, making it February 31st. But before it does the overfly rules, it then does first day of, which resets the day number to 1, and only then does it run the overflow rules. Of course, you're now in the right, it won't overflow anymore, so you now get that the next month after January is February, which is exactly what you want. The same thing doing previous month and last day of previous month, these things work as well, or last day of plus 60 months, whatever you can think of. Well, not everything you can think of, but many things you can think of will also work there. So sort of the last things I want to touch on are things like periods, which is not a great name to have chosen. I think a date iterable would be a better name for it, but again, this is an old API, so can't do anything with that. But what it allows you to do is you can give it a start date, a interval, and then an end date or the number of reoccurrences. So the third argument is overloaded, which is something I also don't like as an API, but what did I know 13 years ago? And then the last argument is some options. So this one says exclude the start date. So what we want to do here is basically list every day of 2018 when PHP London, the user group, has their meetings, which is the first Thursday of every month. So we create this interval that says first Thursday of next month, which is the step that gets executed for every iteration. Now, if we start that on January 1st, then it does next month first, so it will show you February, whatever day it is in February, as the first one. So hence, we're starting the last day of the previous year. I'm not sure how to make that better. Because we don't want to have this start date in a returned result, we say exclude the start date. It does not matter for the end of the year, because the end of the year is never going to be the first Thursday of the month, because that'd be really strange. Yeah, so we create this period object. We say begin, interval, end, and then exclude the start date. Then we call for each over this, and you get every single day that PHP London meets in 2018. As you can see, we just had one last Thursday, because this was the 7th. Does that make sense? I don't actually know what happens if you have an interval that goes backwards. I've never really tested that. I'm sure somebody has written a test for that at some point. All right, so the last thing I want to mention is because people always ask me, how would you store dates and times in a database? Now, it doesn't particularly matter which database you use. The advice is pretty much the same. And the answer is basically it depends. Because most things do, right? So if you want to store a time for an appointment for a group of people in different time zones, you want to store a specific point in time, no matter what happens to daylight saving time rules, or you don't particularly care whether it's 9 p.m. for your coworkers in Europe, no bitter feelings, then you store it as a Unix timestamp, and you store the time zone identifier. You really only need to store the time zone identifier if you want to remember what the original date time was that people put in when they created the appointment. So in MongoDB, what we have here is we have this ISO date type, which is basically the number of microseconds since midnight 1970. So it doesn't have this 131 billion range, but it's still pretty good. And then we store the time zone identifier. MongoDB understands this. MySQL will understand these time zone identifiers and some operations as well to do calculations with. Doing this with MySQL is very tricky because it doesn't really have a built-in database, and although you can load it, it's not a very easy thing to do, and I'm sure none of you have ever tried doing this, right? MongoDB is a bit easier because we sort of stole the PHP implementation for it, so it works exactly the same. At some point, we'll also start supporting this next weekday thing, which I think is quite good. So I got some PHP isms embedded into a database now, which is kind of cool. All right, that was last year my work time. All right, so the other thing is also important. If you want to set up a date time for an appointment in the future for a specific date and time for a specific location, you cannot rely on the Unix timestamp, because if you say this, well, 20 years in the future, who knows whether we're all still on 1 hour plus UTC during the summer here, right? It might be 2 or 3. You never know what people come up with. So in order to make that work, what you really ought to store, you can do it as a string or each number specifically, that doesn't matter, is a string that has this date time information in there. And of course, that never changes. By still storing your time zone, you potentially can infer what the original person wanted, that wanted to store this information, but you always know there's always this specific time for this specific time zone, and you can actually do the calculations with it then. The second thing is probably not what most of you want to do, so my advice is always to be Unix timestamp, or the database variant of that, which is MySQL, is not a date time, by the way, because that stores something like this. Oh. All right, any questions about that? No? Well. Okay, so you can do some queries in MongoDB, but I told you not that I won't be talking about that. But there's a slide of it, so how did that happen? so what it supports is doing like date to string, and it does the same rules as PHP does, except that it looks a little bit different. So what it basically says, this operation says, takes a date to string, use this format, the date in here and the time in that field, and then it will then format the result of you in the right local date, which is kind of handy to have. I think it's kind of cool. All right, I have actually written a book about all this stuff. This book is from 2009, so pretty outdated. However, I'm currently updating it. How that happened, I don't know, because I clearly didn't have enough projects to work on at the same time. But it's being updated currently for PHP 7, all the new things that we've added. I've been replacing, basically doing a string replace with datetime/datetime immutable. That's one of the things, but there's a few other things in there that I want to add as well that weren't in the original book. It won't be out for another year, I can assure you. But the original one is still pretty decent, I would say. All right, are there any questions or queries? Yeah, there's one in the back. You were first, so you got to go.
Going back to the quiz.
Quiz, oh, all the way back to the quiz. You're going to prove me wrong on one of them now, aren't you?
No, I've got another question.
Okay.
If you happen to know the answer. Is there any time where a week does not have 7 days?
Yes. That happens when an area changes their daytime savings time rules to go from before the daytime to after the daytime. And then you suddenly have 6 days in a week. I think it's only Samoa that has done that at some point. Just before the millennium, actually, because they wanted to be the first in the new millennium. Politics, what can I say? But yes, that does happen sometimes. And I think there are a few examples in the past as well where I think a week might have gotten 8 days because of the same reasons. Yeah, that does happen. All right, anything else? One right here.
Can you go from datetime to datetime with immutable
Yes.
and back?
Yes. So, sort of. From PHP 7.3, the answer is yes. And PHP 7.2, you can only go from one to the other, but I don't remember which one that was. I think it was from datetime to datetime immutable. It's still a conversion that you do. PHP 7.3 will also allow you to do the other way. I think Alpha 1 of PHP 7.3 is out. Maybe you should play with that. So yeah, go ahead.
How do you safely pass dates from PHP to JavaScript?
I don't think there's any safe way of doing that. The way how JavaScript deals with time zones, it basically, as far as I know, mostly does what the browser has set, and you cannot do very many calculations with it. Probably your best bet is having an API for doing that on the server side, because it's really complicated to do that. It's the same way as like you can't really guess the time zone identifier from looking at the information that JavaScript outputs. It works sort of on most Linux systems because they will return you like this 3-letter abbreviation sometimes, but on Windows it won't work. So there's no reliable way of doing that, unfortunately. Yeah, I know it's sad, but that's how it goes. With Java, it should be easier because Java has geodatime, which basically implements the same rule sets, or at least the DST rules that PHP also does. So that should work better. All right, so there are a few more. Go ahead.
Is the epoch, is that always in UTC, or
Yes.
is that adjusted for date?
No. Always in UTC. Yeah. Or GMT as it was called back then, but that's another story. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a comment.
Yeah.
Read an article recently, well, I'll come back to the article. Do you deal with the position of the moon?
No.
So apparently, the moon is moving away from the Earth.
Yeah. So this is the reason why we have the leap seconds once in a while. PHP, because this makes things so complicated, and for web applications, this makes no difference whatsoever. Decided not to support any of that. I did actually look into that at some point, but it doesn't really add anything. Yeah, it will take a long. Well, it has been happening since ever the moon came into existence. It was a lot closer than now, and it's moving away. And because of that, long story. We can take that one for the pub.
So does that mean we might be a few seconds behind PHP apps?
Yes, and you can see that easily backwards if you look at GPS time, because GPS time does not have the leap seconds attached to it. So since ever GPS started, no, not since it started, but since the epoch for GPS was started, I think they picked an offset of like 13 seconds of UTC, and it's now grown to whatever, 26 or whatever the number is now. So you can see that back, yeah. And it actually causes issues in handheld devices when they've just changed this. I remember that, I think this is 2006, on January 1st, I'm out hiking with my friends, because what else do you have to do on New Year's Day in Norway? And my GPS thought, even though it said it's like 3 meters accuracy, it was like thousands of kilometers off just because of this second. It's kind of physics is complicated. Yeah, yeah. All right. Anything else? We can talk about GPS time and relativity in the pub as well if you have to.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks very much. Before I let you go, I have one more slide. You'll appreciate it, don't worry. which is joined in.